When steak sandwiches aren't done well, let's be honest, they're not worth anybody's time. They taste bad, the steak's tough, and nobody wants to eat it. But when done properly, man, these can be good. As an Aussie, I think I've got authority to say this. We eat steak sandwiches all the time. In my opinion, there are three things you have to get right. We've got the bread. It needs to be fresh. We've got the steak. Now this is the center of the dish. You get this wrong, the whole thing falls apart. And number three, the flavoring in the sandwich. Now this can go many different ways, but who doesn't love a good chimichurri? So today, I promise you, if you follow this recipe that we're going to go through today, you will have the best steak sandwich of your life. So let's get straight into that. First up, the bread. Now you can make a steak sandwich with any type of bread, but I really love the simplicity and the taste of a focaccia. So we're going to do that today. Now, this book here is fantastic. I would highly recommend picking this up if you're interested in making bread. It has helped me along the bread making journey, which my goodness is a journey. And I'm going to pick some tips from this which will help us make a really tasty focaccia. First up, to a large bowl, 2 cups of flour. It's important to make a huge mess while you're at it. And to that, we'll add 1 heaped tablespoon of white sugar, 1 heaped teaspoon of salt, 1 teaspoon of yeast. This step here is quite important. I'm adding a whole cup of pretty warm water. This will help the yeast come alive. Along with the sugar, things will start moving pretty quickly. We'll add 2 tablespoons of olive oil. This is a really important part of focaccia. It gives the focaccia a really nice texture. All we have to do from there is mix that up. Now it will form quite a shaggy dough, but the important thing is that we get everything really well mixed together. And this is what we would call quite a low hydration dough, so it's really easy to work with. There's not too much water in there, so it's not melting all over the place. Once that's all together, I'm gonna place that in the middle of the bowl there. I'm gonna cover it with a tea towel. We're just going to let it rest for 15 minutes. We'll come back to it. We can start developing some gluten strength. While we're waiting for the dough, let's move on to the chimichurri. And remember, this is a key to making a good steak sambo. The good news is chimichurri is super easy to make. It takes just a few minutes. So, into a bowl, we're going to chop and put all of our ingredients in. The secret to a good chimichurri is to use the freshest ingredients you possibly can find. Parsley, of course, is the key ingredient here. I'm gonna put a whole bunch in there. I'll just chop off the stems there. We're not going to use them. And a really easy way to chop up herbs is to roll them up lengthways like this. And you can see they're kind of all twisted together. And then we'll roll them up the other way as well. And you can see it's all this kind of one nice little package there, which is really easy to chop up. So we're just going to run our knife through this. So we want this pretty fine, to be honest. The finer we chop this, the more we open up that parsley, and that flavor is really going to come through. It's going to offer us that really punchy, nice herby flavor that's going to cut through that richness of the steak. Once that's done, scoop it up into a bowl. Make sure you get everything and off to the side. And if you've had chimichurri before, you'll remember it's quite acidic, and that actually comes from the vinegar. Traditionally, we actually use red wine vinegar. I'm actually using apple cider vinegar in this taste. I really love the taste that it brings. It also brings the acidity. Now you can of course be traditional and use the red wine vinegar, but most types of vinegar will work. You can use white wine vinegar, red wine vinegar, apple cider vinegar, malt vinegar, you name it. If it's a vinegar, you can use it. The one I'd probably stray away from would just be distilled vinegar. It doesn't bring any extra flavor, but of course, if that's all you've got, well, that's fine. You can use that too. We're going to add 2 tablespoons of that vinegar. We've got some garlic here. We're going to add that as well. Just going to peel that. Now, depending on how much you like garlic, this adds an extra bit of punch as well. You can add either 1 or 2 cloves of garlic. I'm going to add 2. I love garlic. Certainly just be mindful of who you're hanging out with after this, because you might stink. So grate that up nice and fine. That's going into the chimichurri there. I'm just using a microplane here. If you don't have one of these, you can just chop it up. That's absolutely fine. To that, I'm going to add a pinch of salt. And a really interesting part of chimichurri is that they actually use oregano traditionally. Now, oregano is a really powerful herb, so we don't want too much. We'll say 1/4 to 1/2 of a teaspoon. That is more than enough, and you will taste that the whole way through the chimichurri. Next up, chili flakes. You can choose how spicy you want your chimichurri. Now, I generally add about 1/2 teaspoon, about that much to this. That adds a nice amount of heat to the chimichurri without blowing my socks off. The last thing that we'll add is a little bit of paprika. I'm going for 1/2 teaspoon here, straight into the bowl. Super important, of course, to the chimichurri is the liquid that carries it. It is always traditionally an oil. In this case, I'm using olive oil. I think it brings a really nice punchy flavor as well. If you were to use olive oil, make sure it's extra virgin olive oil. I'm adding 1/3 of a cup to the chimichurri, and I'm gonna get that straight in there like that. All that's left to do is to mix that up all together. If you have a mortar and pestle, this would work even better in there. You can bruise the leaves a bit and it just brings out a bit more flavor that way. In fact, I'm going to do just that. I've got a mortar and pestle. This will also help just tenderize everything because we do have a few of the stems in there, which is totally fine. Will just help us out in the long run. So I'm gonna put that all into a mortar and pestle. I'm just gonna grind that up. And there you have a super tasty chimichurri sauce, which honestly took less than 5 minutes. I'm gonna set that off to the side. Okay, let's come back to the bread. You'll see things have started to change already. That yeast is already starting to work, but we haven't developed any gluten strength yet. And we need to do that now because things are going to start happening pretty quickly. This isn't sourdough. We don't have 10 hours for the bulk ferment. We are working on the time scale of minutes. So let's sort this dough out. With a wet hand, I'm just gonna take that dough. Now I actually like to do this on my bench top, so I'm gonna move my chopping board aside. I'm gonna take my dough and put it onto the bench. And all I'm going to do here is take the dough, I'm gonna slap it onto the bench and fold it over. We slap it onto the bench and fold it over. We're not working with heaps of dough here, but there's enough to do this technique. And this is called a slap and fold. And you'll see already, that dough is looking much, much tighter and there's a lot more strength in that dough. You can see it's now a cohesive ball, whereas before it was just a shaggy mess. So we're gonna do that a few more times. So you slap the dough, you fold over, and then you drag towards yourself. The moment you start seeing little rips in that dough, we've stretched the gluten to the max of its capacity. We're going to take it and rest it for a little longer. If you don't have one of these, I suggest you get one. They are such a good tool, especially for making bread. More on that to come. So while that dough is proofing, we need to talk steak. And it's important we don't make a mistake here. Why am I like this? Now, for a good steak sandwich, you should get the best steak you can possibly afford, especially if you're trying to impress someone. Let's talk about different cuts and what will work really well for a steak sandwich. Now, the gold standard, the best all-round flavor would be the ribeye or the Scotch fillet in some countries. It's rich, it's tender, it has heaps of flavor. It's really expensive too. Now, if you don't want to buy a ribeye, there are some other good options for you as well. Another really good cut is a filet mignon, or a tenderloin as it's called in other countries. This cut carries heaps of flavor, super tasty. It's a bit more affordable than a ribeye steak. Another great cut is a New York strip or a sirloin strip. Those names are interchangeable depending on what country you find yourself in. Carries heaps of flavor and also really tender as well. Now the next on the list, and the one that I'm actually going to use because it's my personal favorite, is the T-bone steak. Now in this instance, the actual bone has been removed and I've just got the steak here. You can see we've got a big fat cap, lots of marbling, and it's a really nice thickness as well. And that's really important as well to make sure that we don't overdo this steak when we're cooking it. It is so easy to overcook steak. We just don't want that in a steak sandwich. So when we have a big, thick cut, we have a bit more control over it because we have a bit more time when we're cooking. Another really great and budget-friendly choice is a flat iron steak. It is a really underrated cut of meat. It carries a lot of flavor as well. It's not as tender as the other cuts of meat, but it is way more affordable. So perhaps if you're cooking for lots of people or you're on a really tight budget, well, a flat iron really could be the best value for money here. But regardless of the steak, we need to season it, and we need to season it really well. So all I'm going to do to the steak is I'm going to season the top and the bottom with a healthy amount of salt. I don't actually mean healthy. It's definitely not a healthy amount of salt, but a good amount of salt. You know what I mean. And that's it. That's all we're gonna do to the steak. We're going to leave it like that. And the best way to do this, honestly, is to leave this in the fridge uncovered overnight. If you can put it on a tray so there's a bit of airflow, it will help form a really nice crust on this steak. I'm doing this on a time constraint, so I'm not going to do that, but I am going to leave this to rest just outside until that bread is cooked. Okay, let's finish up with this bread. So, you can see things are starting to happen. That yeast, because it's instant active yeast, it's going to proof really quickly. So we're going to do one more stretch and fold, and then we'll put it in its resting place where it can proof, and then we'll put it straight into the oven. So again, with 2 wet hands, I'm gonna scoop this dough out onto the bench, and we're gonna do those stretch and folds. In this case, they're slap and fold. So we slap the dough over, we fold it, and we pick it up on a 90-degree angle, and we do it again. Simple as that. I'm trying to be delicate here because I don't want to release too much of that gas that the yeast is producing, because that's what makes the dough really nice and fluffy. And there you go, simple as that. That dough now has quite a good amount of strength, and we're going to put that straight into a pan. Before you pick your pan, we need to talk of a really common mistake with focaccia. When you choose a pan, the common mistake that people always make, and I see this all the time, is that people choose a pan or a baking tray way too big for what they need. And it just means that the focaccia comes out like a cookie. It comes out and it's like a centimeter or 2 thick. It's really tough because it's lost all of the moisture, and there's just no height or no substance to it. And the way that we fix this is to choose a baking dish or a baking tray that is twice the size of the dough ball that you made. So you can see here, we've got a dough ball which is roughly this big, and we have a baking tray which is roughly this big, but the width of it is no bigger than the width of the dough ball itself. So choose a baking tray, one that is not too big, and to that baking tray, we're going to add quite a bit of oil, more than you think. It basically needs to coat the entirety of the bottom. Focaccia really is a type of fried bread, and we don't want this getting stuck at all. Now, if you're feeling a bit uneasy about the pan that you're going to be cooking in, I would suggest putting a piece of baking paper down. In fact, I'm going to do this for this pan here because I have had bread get stuck in this. So whether you've decided to use baking paper or not, we're going to put quite a bit of oil at the bottom of the pan. Now add more than you think. Focaccia is a type of fried bread, so that oil down the bottom is going to help us get a nice crispy base. And if you're not using baking paper, it's the only thing that's going to prevent your focaccia from getting stuck, so make sure you add enough. I'll then take the focaccia and I'll put it straight into that pan, and I'm gonna spread it out as much as I can. We're going to let this rest for a moment, and when that gluten relaxes, it will take up that whole pan. And once you're at this point here, we'll preheat the oven to 200 degrees Celsius so that everything's ready to go. We can chuck it straight into the oven. So the chimichurri is ready, the steak's ready to cook, the bread is proofing. We of course need to figure out what we're going to put on the steak sandwich itself. This is a pretty safe bet, and you can choose what you want. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to use some pretty routine vegetables here. I've got some lettuce, I've got some tomato, and I've got some red onion. I'll keep it as simple as that. Now I'm just gonna slice up the tomato. Now I don't want the tomato to overpower everything, so I'm gonna slice it up nice and thin. I'll set that aside for later. I've also got some beautiful lettuce leaves, so I'm just gonna take a few of those. I'll set those off aside as well. Of course, the red onion. We don't want to overpower this sandwich with onions, so I'm just going to use a really small amount. I'm gonna slice it really thinly as well. You can very quickly ruin a dish with raw onion, so we just need to be careful. So I've left this dough for a little while now, and it's looking great. It's doubled in volume, that's what we're looking for. Now we don't want this to go too far. If we go any further than double in volume, the yeast would have spent too much energy before it goes in the oven and it won't rise properly. So this is what we're looking for. Once we're here, we're going to need some more olive oil. This is where we dimple the focaccia. So we're going to drizzle that oil on top, put the oil down, wet your hands, and all you do is very lightly dimple the focaccia. And you want this dimpling to be even across it. And if you notice any spots where that dimpling hasn't happened, just make sure you get your finger in it, and that's enough. We don't need to dimple it too much. I'll then get some salt, and I'm gonna sprinkle that over the top of the dough because that will add just a bit more flavor. We're here, it's gonna go straight into the oven. Now, depending on how much dough you have, your baking tray size, the amount of time it will need in the oven will vary. Now, we'll keep an eye out. It will be anywhere from 20 to about 40 minutes, but we're looking for a nice golden texture and for it to be cooked the whole way through. Now, while the focaccia is in the oven, it is a great time to cook your steak, especially if you have a thick cut of steak like the one that I have. It will give it time to cook, and then it will give it time to rest, which is a really important thing. So, to cook this steak, we're going to need a pan that will fit the steak. We want this pan hot. Now, I'm using a carbon steel pan because this is going to give us a really good sear. You can use most pans. Carbon steel in particular is really good for steak. Cast iron is fantastic. Of course, you can use stainless steel as well. So our pan is nice and hot now. I'm actually going to start by rendering the fat. Now, once I feel that fat cap is nicely rendered, I'm just going to put it on to one of the main sides. Now, contrary to popular belief, it's actually a good thing to move your steak around. It keeps that heat nice and evenly distributed and also nice and hot. Super important tip here. Do not be afraid to use a temperature probe. Most good chefs use a temperature probe. It will tell us when this steak is perfectly cooked. I'm aiming for an internal temperature of 55 degrees. That will be medium rare, perfectly cooked. Now, because this is such a thick steak, what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to place this in the oven with the focaccia until I reach the desired internal temperature. This is called a reverse sear, and it's a fantastic way to cook a steak if it's a really thick cut of meat. So let's get that in the oven. So I pulled that steak out now. It only took about 10 minutes. Now I'm going to check the internal temperature here, and we're sitting at about 53, 54 degrees, and that is perfect temperature. When we let this rest, which we're going to do now, it will slowly come up to temperature. It might hit about 60 degrees, and that will mean that this steak is perfectly cooked. It's going to be medium rare on the inside. So I'm going to set this aside to rest now. We'll just leave it alone. And pretty soon after that, the focaccia is all done. And that looks pretty damn fantastic. Fresh bread is always the best way to go. To get that lovely gloss that you see on focaccia, we're just going to put a little bit more olive oil on top while that cools down, and we'll soak that up. You don't need much, just a little bit. And there we go. We're going to take the focaccia, take it out of the pan and put that onto a cooling tray. If you were worried about the amount of oil that we used in this bread, well, I wouldn't be too worried because you can see here that bread hasn't absorbed all of that oil in the pan. We simply used that to make sure it didn't get stuck. Because if this bread got stuck, well, that's the end of the recipe. You'd just be having steak by itself. That steak has been resting long enough now, so I'm going to take that off, put that on the board, and we're going to finally slice this up. Now I'm going to slice this against the grain. Really important with steak to keep things nice and tender. We slice against the grain. It gives it a much nicer mouthfeel. This deserves a nice knife. Next up, the bread. Because we baked this in the right size dish, you can see this focaccia has some pretty good height to it, which is what we want in a sandwich. To do that, I'm just gonna cut this in half because I think we've got enough bread here for 2 servings. And look at that. That looks fantastic. All right, to put this together, let's cut this bread in half lengthways, open that up, and we'll start with our chimichurri. Now you want a pretty healthy amount of this stuff because it tastes so good. We of course are gonna put our steak on there, get some of the best bits you can find. I've got 3 lovely big pieces there. That looks friggin' awesome. Now to take this to the next level, let's get some cheese and put that on top. But we won't stop there. There is one thing we need to do to that. Why not? I'm just gonna tear up some of that lettuce on there. We've got our thinly sliced tomato. And lastly, to finish that off, a bit of red onion. Does it get any better than that? We've got our fresh bread, we've got our perfectly cooked steak, our chimichurri to bring that bite and that kick, and everything tied off nicely with some vegetables. Let's give that a go. That is so good. Oh, let's wrap that up here so I can finish this. Whoa. That is everything for today. So please give this a go. And if you liked today's video, well, we have these coming out weekly, just like this one. So stick around, subscribe if you want. And until then, happy cooking.